seats over here. Good evening, everyone. It's happening more and more. Am I on? It's a brand new microphone, too, you know. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're very, very pleased to have with us this evening Adam Brookes, who's here to talk about his new book, Fragile Cargo, The World War II Race to Save the Treasures of China's Forbidden City. Adam, for many years, worked as a journalist, mainly for BBC News as a correspondent in Jakarta, Beijing, and here in Washington. And drawing on some of those experiences, he began writing spy thrillers about a decade ago. Fragile Cargo is his first nonfiction book, but it reads like a novel in telling the gripping story of determined Chinese curators who sought to save a trove of priceless antiquities, first from Japanese invaders during World War II, and then from potential looters during the communist takeover of China. This vast array of Chinese artifacts, paintings, silk, jade and ivory carvings, scrolls, tapestries, porcelain, had been amassed over centuries by a long line of emperors who had hoarded the pieces within their palace walls and actually had made use of a number of them in their rituals and other activities. Hundreds of thousands of objects in these imperial collections rather amazingly escaped destruction during wartime China by being transported over mountains and along rivers by train, truck, ship, raft, and other means to various distant storage facilities. In recounting this tale, Adam provides lots of detail about these treasures and vividly describes the chaos and complexity of the time. He also highlights the vital role of a small band of museum curators. The chief among them is Ma Heng, who was director of the Palace Museum in Beijing's Forbidden City and led much of the salvaging effort. Tragically, after 1949, Ma Heng was persecuted by communist authorities who were seemingly suspicious of his earlier wealth, Western tastes, and ties to the previous nationalist government. He was largely sidelined and died of cancer in 1955. The Publishers Weekly called Adam's book a riveting and bittersweet history, and another reviewer praised Adam's sure eye for the kind of luminous detail that can bring a story like this to life. In conversation with Adam will be Wei Fong, the Chief Communications Officer at Human Rights Watch. Former journalist herself, Wei reported for the Wall Street Journal and won a shared Pulitzer for her coverage of China. She's also the author of a book 7 years ago called One Child, about China's ill-fated experiment in social engineering. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Adam Brookes and Wei Fong.
Thank you so much for that introduction.
Yes, thank you, and thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see such a great crowd.
Well, thank you all, and wow, I love the big dog there too. Hey, Kathy, how are you? You know, Adam, when you wrote this book and I read it, weeping at the end, by the way, it was so good, and I don't normally weep. My husband will say so, but one of the things I really, really loved about the book was that you made museum curators the heroes, you know, and that nerdy part of me really rejoices at that part. And when I try and explain the story to friends who aren't knowledgeable about China or Chinese art, I try to say, well, you know, it's kind of like if you imagine if you took the Gutenberg Bible and the Rosetta Stone and the Mona Lisa and maybe a big chunk of Stonehenge, and you carted it around an area twice the size of Europe for 2 decades to evade the Nazis. That is the equivalent of the story. Now, I'm wondering what made you want to write the story? You know, this has taken years of your life, a lot of research. What was the spark that inspired it all?
It was really the fact that the story had not been fully told in English. There's really just one chapter in one previous book that takes a good stab at it, but that was nearly 30 years ago it was written. Since then, all kinds of primary source material has come out in China relating to the story. And it was one of those things where, for someone who, a reporter and jobbing commercial writer, to feel a story like that kind of land on the desk and realize that nobody else had done it. And I was sort of in a position to be able to have a crack at it because I have some Chinese and I've spent some time in China. So I kind of knew some of the larger historical contours around the story. But it was too good a story to miss. And one of the things when you come across a story like this, frequently you think, it's like in journalism, when there are going to be holes here, there are going to be things I've got to patch up, there's going to be absences and corners I'm going to have to turn. But the more I looked at this story, the better it got. And the reason it got so much better was the curators that you were talking about. The people who packed up this art into 20,000 wooden cases in 1932-33, and who then for 16 years transported it all over China, all through World War II. They were intellectuals of the Chinese Republic, and they were people who had taken part in that extraordinary transformation, emotional, intellectual, psychological transformation of China in the 19-teens and 20s. Usually referred to as the New Culture Movement and the May 4th movement. And these guys were in this crucible. Ma Heng, the guy that you referred to in your introduction, was this remarkable man who had a vision for how to modernize ideas about scholarship and archaeology, particularly in China. And he established one of the first institutes to study archaeology. And then these guys all went into the Forbidden City for the very first time in late 1924. And these were the guys that, for the first time, clapped eyes on the imperial art collections of China that had been secret and hidden before. No one had ever seen them before. And Ma Heng and these remarkable people did all that, and they catalogued 1.17 million objects in the imperial collections. And then they wrote memoirs about it to tell you all about it. So the material was there, the people were there, and to my enormous good fortune, the story just kind of dropped in my lap.
Well, that's fantastic. But, when you tell me a little bit about these treasures that were carried, because I think quite a lot of us have experienced two kinds of emotions that range from you're standing in, say, a school-led, exhibition somewhere in a museum. You're bored to death. You're reading something. It makes no difference to you. You're just inundated with facts and figures. And then there's the other end where you see something, and you see something of the vision of the artist or the craftsmanship, or that brief moment in time that gives you the glimpse into what it was like when this was made. And so you're talking about 5,000 years of civilization, huge amounts of artwork. What were some of your sort of, best sparked objects that really caught your imagination?
I focus on a couple of pieces in the book, 3 or 4 pieces that I try to kind of follow them almost as characters in their own right through the whole journey. So the first one is a hand scroll, a Chinese painting from the 10th century called, usually in English it's called Early Snow on the River, which is this fabulous ink on silk study of the lives of fishermen in the 5 Dynasties, 10 Kingdoms period, painted by a student called Jiang at the Imperial Painting Academy in this little kingdom called Southern Tang. and it sits very beautifully within the context of Chinese landscape painting. But it is just the most gorgeous, generous, warm, loving, expressive, humanistic study of what it means to kind of be in the world in that place at that time, with snow falling on a river and fishermen in their boats peering into their nets and poling their skiffs across the water. Another piece that I look at is a piece of porcelain, a ewer, a jug with a lid on top, from the Ming, from the reign of Xuande. But the thing that's special about it is the glaze. It was made in the great porcelain city, Jingdezhen. But the thing that's amazing about it is the glaze. It's a copper red glaze. And effecting this glaze in the kiln is fantastically difficult. You have to fire it in reduction, meaning no oxygen in the kiln. It has to be incredibly hot. And only then, when you get the conditions perfect, does this copper glaze turn into this deep, luscious red. And for every successful glazing, they would have thousands of failures. So this is vanishingly rare, this glaze. They only did it for about 20 years. Then it kind of fell out of practice. So this red glaze, and what it says about the early industrialization of China, and the way that porcelain went on to be this extraordinary world-changing commodity. So you can see all these larger stories getting told through these objects. Perhaps the best part of the story is the Stone Drums of Qin. The stone drums are these hunks of granite that in about 500 BC were inscribed with poetry. And they're inscribed in a very rare and very important early transitional script. So they're fantastically culturally valuable. But they're also terribly fragile because the granite is flaking and all these inscriptions are falling off. But each of these stones with these inscriptions on weighs about half a ton. They're chunks of rock. So the curators had to figure out a way, when they decided to evacuate the collections from Peking in 1933 to protect them from the Japanese invasion, they had to figure out a way of packing these half-ton chunks of rock with incredibly fragile surface on them into these specially made cases. And then they had to transport them, nearly 9,000 miles around China. So the pieces themselves have these remarkable stories attached to them, and there are any number of them.
You're missing out my two favorite pieces, which I think ended up in the Taiwan Palace Museum, right? Which are super popular because for Chinese people, what's beautiful in art is what looks like food. So that's the famous jade
cabbage,
and a piece of pork, basically.
which they label in English as the meat-shaped stone, right? Which is just, it doesn't tell you really what it is.
But it looks exactly like a piece of fatty pork.
It looks like a piece of pork belly, doesn't it? And both those pieces, the jade cabbage is a piece of jadeite carved into the shape of what we would call a Napa cabbage, a Chinese cabbage, with insects in the leaves. It's got a cricket and something else in the leaves. And it has become the most beloved piece of beloved carving in all of Chinese culture, I think.
Yes, people stand in line for hours to go
and
and
hours
get
and
a
hours.
look
It's in
at that
Taipei today.
cabbage.
It's in the museum in Taipei.
And the pork.
And the pork too. They're beautiful pieces. There's a rather lovely little episode in the book where one of the curators that I follow, a guy called Na Zhiliang, for the first time in 1929, when they've just opened up the Palace Museum, the Forbidden City, the home of emperors, has turned into a museum, and they're selecting what objects to put on display from the imperial collections. And Na Zhiliang sees this weird-looking cabbage thing, and he thinks, well, I wonder if that should go on display. So he puts it on display. And the Chinese public fall in love with it at the time. And tens of thousands of people come to this young museum in the Forbidden City to see the jadeite cabbage. And Na Zhiliang says rather ruefully in his own memoir, I have no idea why they loved it so much, but it became the most adored piece in all of Chinese art. And it still is. I don't know why. Why is it? Why do people love it so much?
I think everybody loves this whole, what looks like reality so artistically created, right? This is why we love portraiture. And for, I think, maybe this is not a hypothesis here, for people that have experienced enormous amounts of famine, it's just really beautiful to see objects of food. I mean, it's revered, so we do quite like that. So, but that's it. Well, I find what I find really fascinating about a book is, on one hand, there are all these extraordinary stories about the treasures that have been created and captured and saved for eternity. But on the other hand, it feels sometimes like the artworks are, in a way, a MacGuffin, right? The transportation of them are going all around in this you take the readers through these war-torn, enormously challenging situations, right? We are taken to the fall of Shanghai, the rape of Nanjing, and so forth. And at some point, I think readers will start wondering, there's just so much invested into transporting what are objects. At the same time, there's the backdrop of, a situation where lives are basically held very cheaply. And I wondered how you toggled with that very interesting, two very different themes.
And also how they did. I mean, they put an awful lot of effort into transporting that stuff all over China while, in the most appalling wartime conditions. I wanted the story to get told for its own sake in the book, but I also, part of my intention is to try and draw you into the story of China's Second World War, which I think we have somewhat memory hold in Europe and the United States. I feel like our understanding of World War II has become rather reductive. It's been drawn down to a few very kind of finely polished narratives that we hear about again and again and again. And the larger picture, the larger scale and scope of World War II and voices particularly from Asia, really never get heard. And you just have to look at a bookshelf in a bookstore and see the number of books about Normandy and Guadalcanal and the Battle of Britain, and there's really very, very little, if anything at all, about the war in China. Somewhere between 14 and 20 million people died in China during World War II. I mean, the war happened there on a colossal scale. The naked brutality of the Japanese invasion is breathtaking. And the war in Asia is also, I think, much more visible as a clash of empires than the war in Europe is. You really get a sense of how World War II was this imperial war when you look at Asia. So I wanted to tell the story of the art and of the people, but I also wanted to try and set it against this backdrop. So I hope that my hope for the book is that you will walk away from it perhaps reconsidering your understanding of the scale and the scope of the Second World War.
So another reason why this book is very fascinating for me is because it can be viewed in so many ways, and it has been, right? For mainland China, where this story is a little bit more known, the story is a wonderful testament in many ways to the ability their own abilities to save their art, their civilization, their precious objects in a time of such great testing, and oppression. Now, I'm not quite sure what the story would be in Taiwan, but I would say that there probably, as you alluded to in your book, there's both sides sort of see these possessions as a sort of proof of I call it an essential eternal Chineseness that could not be undone by time or war or revolution. Now, do you find much of this division and how it's received by different audiences, and how, in the light of these escalating tensions that we see, how is that illuminating?
I stopped the book in 1955 partly because I didn't want to get into the really tricky questions of the People's Republic of China versus Taiwan and the very fraught relationship between the museums themselves. So, I mean, no spoilers, but at the end of this story, at the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, when the communists are taking over China and the Republic of China is collapsing, these treasures that have been together through thick and thin, and the curators that who have also been together through thick and thin, they split. And some of them go off to Taiwan, and some of with the retreating nationalists, with Chiang Kai-shek and the retreating Republic of China, and some of them stay on the mainland. Some of the curators stay behind and wait for the communists. Some of the curators flee to Taiwan. So the collections and the people are kind of riven at the end by the Taiwan PRC divide. Today, the story is a sort of founding myth for both of the museums, both the Taiwan Palace Museum, where some of the imperial collections reside today, and the Beijing Palace Museum, which still lives in the Forbidden City. And for a while there, the two museums were getting on quite well, is my understanding. There was scholarly exchange, and they were kind of talking to each other, and they were kind of putting history to one side and not.
But they never lent the objects from Taiwan back home.
They would never lend
to
them
mainland
back
China,
home
right?
because they were worried that the PRC would never release them again. But that has now, I think, changed, and things have got a lot more fraught in the last few years as we've seen PRC-Taiwan relations get more and more fraught. The relations between the museums too have started to, I think, break down somewhat. For the PRC, having all those treasures, those Chinese treasures in Taiwan, was always quite useful because they acted as a kind of cultural anchor, right? They were evidence that Taiwan was in fact part of a greater China. For many in Taiwan who advocate for or desire an independent Taiwan, these treasures have become irrelevant to them. They say that these things should disappear back. They're nothing to do with us. They're Chinese. They're not Taiwanese. So the treasures themselves today continue to hold this kind of political and cultural charge in a way that is quite sort of fraught and quite difficult to talk about. And no matter how you talk about them, you sort of end up offending somebody.
So how much of the treasures actually ended up saved? I mean, how much was actually lost to looting or destruction or wartime destruction?
So the imperial collections themselves, when they were in the Forbidden City and were the horde of emperors, they towards the end of the Qing Empire, the late 19th century, stuff started going missing. A lot started going walkabout. Palace officials, eunuchs, all sorts of people, even princes themselves were pilfering among the imperial collections in the Forbidden City, and the stuff was finding its way out to art dealers in Peking, and the art dealers of Liulichang Street in Peking, and they were selling on to Western dealers. So stuff was going to Europe, it was going to the United States and to Japan. So a lot went missing during that period. After the curators came in 1924 and catalogued the whole lot, the collections were brought much more under control. Some stuff still did go missing for a few years after that. Once it all got crated up for evacuation, none got stolen, as far as I can tell. Nothing in the primary sources indicates or suggests that there was a lot of thieving after that time because the catalogues were so precisely done. Quite a lot got broken en route, as you can imagine. And the best account of this whole, the whole story, which I quote a great deal in the book, was written by a curator called Ouyang Daoda. And he was a rather bad-tempered, starchy disciplinarian of a curator. And he was sort of in charge of discipline among the entire operation, the transport operation. And every time a piece gets broken, he makes a note of it, of exactly what it was, what case it was in, what its number was in the catalogue. And then he sends out these missives to all the other curators saying, if we remove these treasures from their home in Peking in order to save them from the Japanese, and then we break them en route, we are wasting our time. Right, and he does this every time. He's livid every single time his piece gets broken. At one point, the cases are stored temporarily in an old opium warehouse in the wartime capital Chongqing, and nobody's checked the floorboards, and the joists underneath are rotten. So they start stacking these cases full of irreplaceable art up, and the entire floor gives way, and the cases go crashing down into the basement. And Ouyang Daodar does this long list: 3 pieces of Ming white porcelain, 2 Kangxi bowls of everything that gets broken. On another occasion, a truck is driving away from a train, having just been loaded up with cases that have come off a train, drives over a railroad crossing and doesn't look both ways, and a locomotive comes smashing into the back of the truck. But the only stuff that gets broken in that event is a series of glass domes that they use to cover clocks and are totally valueless. So throughout this whole thing, they have ridiculously lucky escape after lucky escape. Places where they store the cases get bombed after the cases left, like a matter of weeks after they left. At one point, they're stacked on a raft being hauled up a river in Sichuan, and the ropes break and the raft gets washed away, and everyone's convinced that it's going to overturn and everyone's going to be drowned, and somehow they save it. And it's an absurd series of near misses. And the curators themselves are writing in their memoirs, this is ridiculous. We got away with it again. The amount that got broken was only a small fraction of the total shipped, but it was certainly hundreds of pieces.
Well, that's amazing. That's certainly much more safe than if they'd stayed in my house with my children playing, that's for sure. So here's a question I have, and you alluded to it a little bit too. This is a little bit off ball, but we talked a little bit about the U.S.-Taiwan tension. China and Taiwan tensions, and of course that's also extension to what's happening in the U.S. And given you just mentioned in our chat previously that you were giving a whole lot of talks and interviews talking about the balloons and the spy balloon issue, and this of course relates to your previous other works on spies and the whole craft. And I'm just kind of curious as to, here you are doing a book talk about Chinese treasures. Here is this situation going on, and what have you been telling folks about what this all means?
What have I been saying about what this all means? I did stop the book in 1955 for a reason.
There were balloons then, I believe.
So the first thing that I was telling people was that in World War II, I'm sure plenty of people in this room know this, but if you don't, in World War II, the Japanese military launched 9,300 balloons against the continental United States. There was a huge military balloon program. These balloons were launched on the Japanese home islands, and they floated over to the United States, and they were loaded with incendiary bombs. And the idea was that these Japanese balloons were going to set the west coast of the United States on fire. They worked in principle in that the balloons arrived on US and Canadian territory, but the equipment on them failed almost universally. And so they never actually exploded when they got here. But there's plenty of photographs and imagery of these balloons all over. So this was the first intercontinental aerial weapons platform, right, was the Japanese military balloon program in World War II. The British also used balloons against the Germans, interestingly. They launched thousands and thousands of quite small balloons which trailed metal tails on them, long metal tails, so that when they hit German power lines, they would short out their power lines. And they had some success in messing around with the German power grid. So balloon warfare is not new. And we know that the PRC has made a very in-depth study of the Second World War and the conflict between Japan and the United States in order to, tease out its kind of strategic contours and figure out where wars in the Western Pacific get fought and how they get fought. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if they had picked up on the balloon program from seeing the Japanese balloon program in World War II. I guess the other thing that occurs to me that's important about this whole thing is that until recently, we in the United States did not shoot down these balloons, and now we do. So that's a change, that's a policy change. And I think it's plausible to imagine, there are people in this audience who know much more about this than me, and I should probably be deferring to them. But I think it's plausible that it will be read in Beijing as a policy change. And we've seen statements from the Chinese side already saying, well, we now reserve the right to shoot down your stuff if any of that should wander into PRC airspace. So, I mean, what concerns me about this is that we just see little incremental escalations that make this situation more rather than less fraught. And I think we can probably look at the balloon in that context.
Quite possibly this will be incorporated in a piece of work of art that will be, one hopes, lives on decades and centuries later as a part of the collection. But I apologize for that slight detour there. What I really wanted to do was open up the floor for questions, which many of you will no doubt have. Just a couple of quick rules of housekeeping. This event is being live streamed, so we do ask that you step up to the mic there. Otherwise, this won't be captured and people who aren't here can't see these questions being asked. And of course, the next thing after the questions will be the book signing. So perhaps we should just open it up first very quickly to who would like to ask first. It looks like, yeah.
Thank you for an interesting talk. Just as context, Canada put a lot of money into trying to save the art treasures in the Hermitage when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s. And kind of thinking along those lines, I have one comment and one question. The question is, was there any effort like that by Western museums to help save these treasures? That's the question. And the comment is, carting them all around China in the way it seems to have happened seems to me incredibly impractical. Why were they not just put on a train and taken to, say, Tibet or far southern China? I'm sure there's an answer, but I'll leave it to you.
First, on the museums, no, they didn't get any help. They got some financial help from the British, in effect, but no one came to help them out. As to the second question, fundamentally, that's what they did. They moved the cases from Peking in 1933, first to Shanghai, then to Nanjing, and then they broadly followed the Yangtze River to West China, and they went to Sichuan province in the far west of China, as a part of this massive migration that took place before the Japanese advance. You know, tens of millions of people fled the Japanese advance, so did the Chinese government, so did factories and universities and schools, and it was one of the greatest migrations in human history. And the art was part of that larger migration. And they went to Sichuan because Sichuan is surrounded by mountains and it's extremely difficult for the Japanese to follow. The Japanese would have had to extend their supply lines way too far. It was not out of range of Japanese bombers, so they were always in danger of being bombed. But China during World War II was hugely chaotic, so they were using any means of transport that they could. Most transport was given over to the war effort. They were improvising day by day. They rented steamships from British companies. Sometimes the military would give them trucks. Sometimes they would hire commercial buses, like omnibuses. I mean, it was an improvised patchwork, last-minute story that sort of refused any orderly management at the time. Yeah.
Yes, but the packing was excellent.
The packing was really good, and I tell you a lot about the packing in the book.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the discussion. It's very interesting. I just wanted to know, can you give us a sense of what percentage of this collection that that was carted around so precariously wound up in other museums, Western museums, or any museums that not the two in Taipei and in Beijing? Thanks.
Of the stuff that was actually crated up, and of the 20,000 cases that I'm talking about, which was perhaps a third or so, a quarter to a third of the entire imperial collections, that stuff didn't go walkabout. It made its way back to Peking and to Taiwan. And the way that we know this is because the catalogues and the inventories were kept very, very precisely. And we know that when those cases ended up in Taipei, we know precisely what went there, and we know that it's in the Palace Museum today. And when the stuff went back to Peking in the 1950s, we know it had ended up there. So of the stuff that they actually crated up and took, it all got home. Of other art and kind of China's cultural patrimony in the Second World War, the story is very different. And we don't really know what happened to any number of other museums, private homes, collections, libraries across China. According to UN figures, before World War II, China had 4,200 libraries around the country. After World War II, there were less than 900 left. The bombing was so bad and the destruction was so bad that colossal amounts of stuff was destroyed. There was certainly looting and plundering by the Japanese, but it seems like we don't really know how much or what went to Japan, or even where it is today. When stuff goes to Japan, I'm told by art historians, it tends to sort of disappear and into private collections, and we don't have a good grasp on what went there. Of the stuff that you see in our museums, most of that left China in the late 19th century, the 1910s, 20s, and early 30s. Much of it after the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. And a lot of it was done by voracious collectors. It wasn't necessarily looted or plundered. It was bought. So there's a whole variety of ways in which art got out of China and stocks our museums. And there's still a great deal of uncertainty worldwide, I think, in the art market about the provenance of much of the material that pops up.
Does anyone have any other questions? Maybe, yeah.
Yes. Many of us have views of Chiang Kai-shek shaped by General Stilwell, Barbara Tuchman et al. Do you come up with any revisionist view of the general in the book?
That's a great question. When I was taught kind of Chinese history as an undergraduate, we were always taught that this period in China was, a contest between the communists on one side and the nationalists on the other. The story was always very kind of both sides. And I have come to feel, and people I'm sure will disagree with me, but I've come to feel that that was a bit of a misrepresentation. I think the Republic of China was a nation state. It was a functioning nation state that was recognized by the rest of the world. It wasn't a very good nation state. It was brittle, fragile, deeply corrupt, and often very cruel. But it was a functioning nation state with a communist insurrection. And as I kind of read around this story, I got a sense, again, historians in the audience should probably be taking this question. But I got a sense that over the last 20 years, 25 years, there's been a lot of scholarly work done rethinking and revising Chiang Kai-shek, who the man was, when his diaries were published, or at least made accessible to historians, 20 years ago now, roughly. I think our image of him at least became more complex, if not a full-on revision of who he was. But I think we're still in a place where a lot of this history is still being recovered and uncovered and rethought and rewritten. The whole history of the Republic, I think, is in that sort of flux. So I think there's more still to know about Chiang Kai-shek, and there's a lot more to know about the people around him, and there's a lot more to know about the people of the time, like my guy Ma Heng, who isn't a figure that anybody knows, but actually played a very significant role in significant bits of the modernization of Chinese culture in the 20s and 30s. So there's lots of stories still to tell, and I think probably we haven't told Chiang Kai-shek's yet.
Great. Next question.
My wife and I get two newspapers, the Washington Post, to get a balanced view of the world, and Wall Street. And one of the papers had a summary of your book, and I'm not sure which one it was.
It was the Wall Street Journal.
It was the Wall Street?
Thank you, Wall Street Journal.
We read it, and we were, just so impressed with it. And then later in the Post, we saw that you were going to be here, and we're so happy we saw that. And
thank
we
you for coming.
appreciate you're here. I guess one of the questions I had, when I think of the task, you said 20,000 crates. That certainly didn't fit in one truck. So I'm thinking, how even logistically, the funding for an operation like that over the number of years, some of the pragmatic things that one has to deal with, and then how do you keep something like that? I don't know how badly the Japanese were after these treasures. How could they miss a line of 50 2.5-ton trucks hauling crates?
Yeah.
I guess they didn't have cell phones during that period of time, so they were lucky about that. But how did...
one of the logistics were, obviously really complicated, and they were very, very improvised. The financing, a lot of it was done by central government. It was never enough. So a lot of the money actually came from the British share of the Boxer Indemnity Fund. That was a big chunk of money that the Chinese were supposed to pay the British as reparations for crimes against British property and British nationals in 1900 during the Boxer Uprising. The British kind of gave it back to China in a sort of act of enlightened self-interest. There was a big chunk of money sitting there. And it just so happened that some of my curators had contacts with people who administered that fund, and the Boxer Indemnity Fund ended up forking out a lot of the money required. One of the great problems with that story was the Boxer Indemnity Fund could only write checks, right? So the poor curators had these checks, but they didn't have any cash. So what the hell are they going to? How are they going to pay the porters and the truck drivers? So all these I go into this stuff in the book. How did the Japanese miss it? The geography of China is such that, it's huge, and the war was fought over an absolutely monumental landscape. But the map of the war, fundamentally, for the purpose of your mental map, it follows the railways. And there weren't very many railways in China at the time. And most everything that happened strategically during that period happened around the railways. So most of it went either by steamship or by rail. And on the railways, they were literally days ahead of the Japanese at times. Right. It really wasn't, it was that close. The 20,000 cases got evacuated out of Nanjing only 10 days before the Japanese took the city. So it really was that precarious. But they pulled it off. They've pulled it off.
Fortunately, they did. Thank you.
That was a great question. Thank you. And I know there are some Wall Street Journal and ex-Wall Street Journal reporters here.
The Wall Street Journal is present
glad to hear that there's a good, strong readership. Yes, sir.
Well, you just answered my main question, which was about the financing of the operation. But one little element still remains in my mind. Was there any temptation or any actual sale of some of the lesser works of art in order to save the more, what they considered to be the more valuable works? Or
no, I don't
anything
think so.
Relating to that in promises to...
They sold off quite a bit of stuff early on that they didn't think was valuable. They sold off in 1929, I believe. They held this huge sale of stuff in the Forbidden City that they thought was just rubbish. Mm-hmm. So they had this huge yard sale of the Forbidden City. And it was mostly a lot of furs, vast quantities of sable and ermine and stuff. They decided that did not have artistic value, so they sold all that. There were huge cases of tea. There was tea everywhere. Some of it very, very old, decades old. So they sold all that off, and there was a vast amount of Chinese medicine. And they sold all that off, and various bits and pieces they didn't think were worth anything. And this created a huge scandal. And people accused them of selling off all this stuff that they shouldn't have sold. And actually the first director of the Palace Museum, who was a man named Yi Peiji, went down in that scandal. And he was hounded from office, and he died alone, impoverished in Shanghai a few years later. It was an awful story. And the guy that I tell you about in the book, Ma Heng, took over from him very reluctantly because he knew what a risk it was to become director of the Palace Museum in these circumstances. That if anything goes wrong, you're going to be blamed for it, and your head will be on the block. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It does sound like some of the money, though, from those earlier sales.
A little bit, yes. They used it.
Directly or
They did use.
indirectly
You're
must
right.
have
They did use a little bit of that money. Yeah, it's true.
So, Adam, I wanted to ask you about the last years of Ma Heng's life, because he is such a hero in your story, and yet after the communists took over, they treated him so shabbily. Why do you think that was?
So this is a tricky one. He was, by this time, Ma Heng had been director of the Palace Museum for 20 years. He was in his late 60s, early 70s, when the communists came to power in 1949. There's this moment when communist troops march into Peking in 1949, and suddenly the ancient capital of China is held by the Chinese Communist Party. The communists take over 2 big hotels, and they set up their headquarters, and they set to work taking over a country, And one of the things that they had to do early on was to try and figure out what to do with the elites of the Republic of China, those who had not fled to Taiwan, and how they were going to be treated. And initially, it looked like the intellectuals and elites themselves felt like they were probably going to be okay. There was a moment there, and there's quite a lot of writing about this and quite a lot of memoir about it, where the communists were quite generous, quite laid back, and everything was quite civilized. And they went to the Palace Museum and introduced themselves to Ma Heng. And in fact, Ma Heng's son was deeply involved with the communists, so we think he was pre-warned about what was going to happen. And then things begin to change. Ma Heng starts keeping a diary at this time for the first time in his life. So we actually hear from him his voice for the first time. And he starts noting suicides and disappearances in 1950. And he notes them all down in his diary. And he begins to sense that there's the origins of political terror. And in 1951, a campaign which we don't know that much about in general, it's called the Sanfan campaign. It's known as the Three Antis campaign. Takes off. Chairman Mao decides that the war effort in Korea is being sabotaged by the bourgeoisie, and the Communist Party is to go into every single business, every single institution in China, and it is to rip out all bureaucratism, waste, and corruption, and the economy is going to be socialized, stat. And all the elites who thought that they were going to get by went down in that campaign. They suffered very badly. They were taken away for interrogation. Some were tortured. Ma Heng was not, probably because of his age. Some were shot. And this was like the opening salvo of, I think, of Chairman Mao's attack on the old elites and his fury at what he ended up calling the stinking ninth category of intellectuals. It began earlier than often we sort of give it credit for, and Ma Heng went down in that campaign. And the final chapter of my book tells that story. So I'm afraid it's not a desperately happy ending to the book. The art was fine, but Ma Heng and many like him were not. Yeah.
So people suffer, things survive. So I think hope I'm not giving away the plot here when I say that's what really happens.
Though later, of course, in the Cultural Revolution, much did not survive. Again, the imperial collections, fascinatingly, in the Cultural Revolution, they're inside the Forbidden City, and the Prime Minister at the time, Zhou Enlai, orders the Forbidden City shut and guarded by the military. So the imperial collections got away with it again. They survived the Cultural Revolution too. Yeah.
Sorry, you had a question?
Well, congratulations on the book. Can you describe a little bit of the kind of the thinking of the curators who decided to stay versus stay in China versus those who went to Taiwan? How did they make their calculus, and also how did they divide the materials? What was that like?
Great questions, and ones that I don't have very good answers to. The two principal curators who stayed behind were Ma Heng, the director, and the guy I mentioned before, Ouyang Daoda, who wrote the definitive account of the whole thing. Why did they decide to stay? I think Ma Heng was probably given assurances by the communists that the Forbidden City would be protected, the collections would be protected, and he would be okay. Ouyang Daoda, I don't know. His memoir stops, he doesn't talk about it, and he never spoke about it to his children, and he never wrote anything ever again. So he becomes a complete unknowable figure. I know that he survived, he didn't go down badly in the purges, but his calculation, I don't know. Ma Heng, I think, stayed because he was old, he had heart problems, he was deeply committed to the Forbidden City and the collections, and I think part of him just couldn't tear himself away from Peking. He missed Peking so terribly when he was on his travels during the war, and he was so glad to get back. I think he just didn't want to go and try and make a new life for himself in Taiwan. The curators who did go to Taiwan prospered, and they lived long and happy lives as teachers and curators and conservators, and they did very well. Yeah. How did they choose the stuff to go to Taiwan? The order came down from Chiang Kai-shek's office that the curators would themselves decide which objects were the very finest and most irreplaceable, and which would serve to demonstrate Chiang Kai-shek's place as the true steward of Chinese culture, the true arbiter and protector of Chinese culture, even in defeat. And so two men, Na Zhiliang and Zhuang Yan, sat down in Nanjing, which is where it all was at the time, and they literally unpacked cases and said, we'll take that, we won't take that. And they packed 3,000 cases, of which about 2,700 actually made it to Taiwan. And among those are some of what they consider to be the very, very finest pieces in the collections. All the Song Dynasty landscapes, the finest porcelain from the Ming. It's a sad moment in the story. But I mean, how they made those decisions was based on what they thought was on their curatorial, discipline, and what they thought was the greatest art at the time. Yeah.
I don't want to send everybody off on this massive downer, even though we do know that some things happen. And so I was wondering, Adam, if you could read the way you closed the book, because I think there was an interesting choice there.
Read the last paragraph of the book?
Yes, because okay, we're not giving away the plot here.
Does anybody ever do this?
Well, because I think it's really beautiful, and I think you've chosen a very interesting way to end the book, with, of course, sequel to come, right? Yeah, so you should get that one too. Well, we know.
Where do you want me to go from?
We know that Ma Heng, for example, he's endured horrible privations. He saved the collection, but he himself has not, in a way, been saved. So, do we just leave the readers with that image of that, or do you want to go on?
Should I go from there?
Yeah.
Right. Glasses.
Want to borrow mine?
The end of Ma Heng's life was laden with ironies. The bitterest of them was surely the way the Communist Party took his devotion to the collections and turned it against him, hounding and humiliating him in his final days. But perhaps a larger, sadder irony resides in the fact that Ma Heng was not present for the reopening of the cases that contained the rarest works of the imperial collections, those that made the journey to Taiwan. He never saw the final act of his own vast feat of conservation. In Taiwan, curators broke the paper seals, pried the wooden cases open, the sound of splintering wood, the smell of straw and mothballs, flecks of cotton rising in the still air, and extracted the pieces from their dark cocoons to bring them back into the light. Zhuang Yan was there, in his spectacles and scholar's robe, and so was stocky, jovial Na Zhiliang, the two of them no doubt peering in, scrutinizing the lifting and unwrapping, alert for any slip or clumsiness, impatient for each breathtaking piece to emerge and declare the fact of its own survival. The art awaited them as it awaits us. Every work, the blood-red glaze on porcelain, the poem worked in stone, the ink on silk of early snow on the river, invites our approach, asks us to hold it in our gaze and incarnate it anew. When we do, the pieces live and voyage again in their stillness, akin to those travelers on the chill riverbank, picking their way past rocks and knotted pine trees, past reeds and moving water and distant, laughing fishermen, astride time as flakes of early snow swirl and scatter on the wind.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. And of course, the usual signing will be. Do you want to make the announcements and the details
Sure.
of that?
Well, thank you both. Copies of Adam's great book are available at the checkout desk at the front. He'll be seated here signing.